Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening. You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 15, Episode 11. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and in this episode, I'll be performing 4 tales to terrify you, courtesy of authors Nicky, Exposito, Chisto, Healy, Dale Thompson, and James Colton. Tonight we'll hear stories of deadly discographies, calamitous compositions, terrifying tragedies, try saying that 3 times fast, and catastrophic concerts. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 2 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support. Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail, so lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show is about to begin. Nothing like a long day of work, and then you get to kick back. Maybe put on some headphones, pour yourself a tall glass of something chilled, and listen to some melodies. Maybe it's a recent album, or an old favorite, or just the screams of your conquered enemies. Yes, music can certainly soothe the savage beast, or, as we're about to find out, maybe enrage it enough to cause a little havoc. Some people seem to have all the luck. One day they're just a typical college student, and then the next they're rocking clubs as the next hit DJ, winning hearts and new fans everywhere they go. But sometimes that kind of influence comes at a price. As we're about to hear Nicky Exposito's tragic tale of a DJ whose music is just going places. Without further ado, I present to you DJ Erich Zann. I need to find DJ Erich Zann, or more likely, the DJ formerly known as DJ Erich Zann. He's probably changed his name. His Spotify and all his socials have been scrubbed. He's definitely left New York. He may or may not still be in the country, but he's out there somewhere, making more of this strange, desynchronous, yet hypnotic music, building a new fan base, luring them in before, Well, a repeat of what happened at the Posey Space in Bushwick on May 31st. 143 people dead. An electrical fire, the investigators claimed, faulty wiring. You know how it is with these poorly maintained, converted warehouses. A fire, the news repeated. Fire was the story they were sticking to. If anyone from the FBI or the CIA or any shadowy X-Files agency knows any better, they aren't saying anything at all. A bartender buddy of mine, Andy, recommended me for the DJ Erich Zann gig. "Dude, you up to work a concert in Bushwick?" He texted me. "A guy called last night, said he found my business card, but I'm already booked in the Lower East Side. Pays $200 for the night, plus tips." I said I'd do it. I recognized the address. The Posey Space was an old warehouse at the ass end of Bushwick, wedged into a corner between the Queens County border and the cemetery, surrounded by other abandoned warehouses, tagged up with metal-roofed awnings and those roll-up doors you see on industrial properties. The owners had rewired and redesigned the inside to be rented out for art shows, concerts, and club nights. Andy sent me a photo of the evening's promotional flyer. It was shiny black with a childlike drawing of a stick figure girl leading a huge fluffy monster on a leash. The design was cute at first glance, but the longer you looked at it, the more disturbing it became. The monster had 5 legs. Its crudely drawn human face was too large for its body. Its toothy mouth seemed less a friendly smile than a threatening sneer. DJ Erich Zann, 10 p.m., 5/31/2024. I spent some time internet stalking DJ Erich Zann. The guy played up the mystique for sure. I found only one photo of the DJ himself, and it wasn't a particularly revealing one. Just a man in a Cthulhu mask and turtleneck standing behind a soundboard with long sleeves and gloves on his hands. I clicked on his YouTube. DJ Erich Zann, the profile read. "We live in a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity." H.P. Lovecraft. He'd also stolen his stage name from an H.P. Lovecraft story. Adorable. I hit play on a video titled Asenath number 14. 350,000 views, 12,000 likes, comments disabled. The music started slow and low, pounding bass over a hazy, barely perceptible electronic rumble. On a video screen against an empty background, bits of white light swirled and exploded and pulled back together, then split into pulsating stars and primary colors. A trilling instrumental melody stretched over the repetitive bass line, rising and falling and shooting off into a million different directions as the colorful stars on screen spun like pinwheels, light blending and shifting and modulating as a frenetic piping overcame the instrumental tapestry. Wow, 50% off. Bill's Better Secondhand Furniture Post, Memorial Day sale. I muted my laptop as an ad replaced the hypnotic EDM melody. Asenath number 14 had been really short. Except it wasn't. Asenath 14 was 33 minutes, 45 seconds long. I frowned. No way I'd listened to that song for over half an hour. I called the number Andy gave me. No one picked up. So, around 8:30, I walked from the train station to the Posey Space, down an alley to the back parking lot and employee entrance. There was clearly something going on. I could hear the thud, thud, thud of electronic bass. But unlike every other time I'd worked the venue, there were no roadies trudging in and out with heavy equipment. There were no people around at all. No cars in the back parking lot either, except for one camper van. That in itself wouldn't be surprising. Plenty of touring musicians live out of vans. But this one was odd because it was completely blacked out, even the windows. I'm not talking about tinted windows. Someone had taken the effort to cover every spot where light might seep through with opaque, dull black material. Assholes committed to the aesthetic, I thought. Even stranger, the rolling door of the loading dock was still closed and locked, as was the employee door. There was a handwritten sign posted there. Absolutely no entry until 10 p.m. My next thought was that eventually one that would save my life. It went, screw that upside down, backward, and sideways. The promo flyer said the event started at 10, which meant the asshole who posted the sign assumed I'd be able to set up a full bar while dealing with a full line of guests wanting to get liquored up before the show. Lucky for me, I poured wine at a gallery pop-up at the Posey 2 weeks before, and I'd forgotten to return the key. The way the Posey space is set up, the bar is in a separate, smaller back room, connected to the showroom by a squat hallway. The employee door opens into the back room, where I found my crates of liquor already deposited on top of the bar. The throbbing bass line emanated from the showroom, rhythmic and looping. I saw moving shadows. I assumed the tech guys were all in there. I got to work organizing bottles as the last of the summer evening light faded to darkness, bass booming in my head, guiding my movements like a conductor. An hour later, I had to pee. I didn't want to annoy the roadies or piss off whoever didn't want me in the Posey space before 10, but the venue's only bathrooms were in the showroom, and the building is isolated amongst a sea of empty warehouses, and my only other option was to whip it out in the parking lot. So I went. At the end of the hallway, I froze. There were figures setting up the stage, but they weren't roadies. They were pitch-black automatons shaped like naked, featureless, sexless humans. Their skin looked like the consistency of clay. There were 6 of them. They moved fluidly, more organic than robotic. Each had arms and legs and, in lieu of a head, a cube-shaped protuberance emitting small peals of gray smoke as they lifted crates of lights and arranged amps on the main stage. I yelped. I backpedaled. My foot caught on something. I stumbled, and a weight gave way and the music stopped. I realized the loop bass line had come from a laptop plugged in on the floor. I tripped over it, and I'd killed the music. Slam! Crash! The metal framing was dropped. The soundboard hit the elevated stage with a hollow thud. Everything the clay-like, pitch-black, humanoid faux roadies had been carrying fell to the ground, as the faux roadies themselves melted, like butter in a pan, into gelatinous black puddles. After the Posey space incident, after that night, I scoured the internet for people who knew DJ Erich Zann, people who knew who he actually was, or who he had been before he was DJ Erich Zann. He kinda just appeared on Spotify in 2021, one Redditor wrote. I thought he was an AI, said another. Didn't he die in a fire at the concert in Brooklyn? Asked yet another. I don't know, maybe start there. His family must have said something. His family, if they existed, hadn't said anything. I'd scoured the internet for an actual photograph of DJ Erich Zann, and even a recording of his voice, and came up with nothing. Finally, user Greg87 direct messaged me. DJ Erich Zann was my roommate, he wrote. I'll be in New York City next week for Tech Week. I can tell you everything. Greg87 is a real guy, with a real name and a family and a life in Pasadena, California. But for privacy purposes, I'll refer to him here as simply Greg. Greg's a Caltech alumnus with a master's in engineering. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Williamsburg. He'd known DJ Erich Zann while they were both college students in the late 2000s. James Hadley, Greg told me, that's his real name. James Hadley and Greg shared a Pasadena apartment a few blocks from the Caltech campus during Greg's senior year of college. James, though a year younger, was already 2 years into a PhD program in theoretical physics. Their residential situation had been arranged by University Student Services for half a semester, Greg said, but it felt more like living with a skittish cat than another young adult. James spent every minute he wasn't on campus barricaded in his room, working through equations or practicing his electric violin with headphones on. Whenever he inadvertently found himself in the same room with Greg, he'd avert his eyes and scurry away like a cockroach in the light. Greg felt sorry for him. He made it his mission to befriend his reclusive roommate, approaching the task as one would set about domesticating a feral pet. Greg stopped studying in his room. Instead, he arranged himself on the couch in the common room, hook his laptop up to the TV and play old Star Trek episodes as background noise. On a rare occasion, James emerged from his room. Greg would invite him to sit and watch. At first, James might linger for a few minutes. Then he started sitting down beside Greg. Finally, after a month of warming up, he brought his own work into the common room so they could study together. When that became comfortable, James, at long last, began to speak. It was school stuff at first, Greg told me. His area was string theory, unification, universe-building stuff, the interchange between particle physics and a potential tapestry of infinite planes. I'm not even sure I can explain it correctly. Eventually, though, I got him to open up about his life outside his research. His family. James Hadley had been the beloved only child of successful parents. When they realized their 7-year-old kid could solve advanced algebraic equations and play Mozart on the violin, they lobbied James's small private academy to skip him from 2nd grade to 7th. He excelled both academically and musically, but his relationship with other children was a source of anxiety. The bigger elementary boys in the neighborhood bullied him for being weird, while his preteen classmates treated him as a spectacle or a pet. Finally, his parents pulled him out of school altogether. His mother, a professor at Cal State's LA School of Education, homeschooled him until, at age 13, James was accepted into Caltech for his freshman year. His mom and dad switched off driving him to and from college, even after he finished undergrad, and began his PhD coursework until that year. That year, both his parents died. His mother in March after a long battle with breast cancer, and his father in July from a sudden heart attack. Without them, James felt alone in the world. They weren't just family. They'd been his cheerleaders, his most enthusiastic supporters, his only friends. I don't know how to live in society, James admitted to Greg. I want friends my own age. I want to go to parties, to socialize, to find my people. I just can't. How about music? Greg asked him. Maybe try and find a band to play with. James took that advice to heart. He bought himself a guitar and practiced in garages with stoners he'd met on Craigslist. But it wasn't a fit. The guy wasn't built to be a rocker. He was too self-conscious, too anal. A black hole of charisma. Then Greg had an epiphany. Electronic music was still relatively niche then, still geeky. James was intrigued. A cousin of Greg's bought Pro Tools to mess with as a hobby, then lost interest. Greg convinced him to sell his entire setup to James at a discount. As a DJ, he could play a character, Greg explained. He could venture out into the world, be the life of the party, surround himself with people, without bursting his bubble. And it worked. It worked better than Greg could ever imagined. James, a musical prodigy with technical skills, took to Pro Tools like a duck to water. The ability to produce sounds no human voice or human hands could produce, for him, was the purest form of creation. His music blended sounds and rhythms together that shouldn't have mixed, but did, into hypnotic harmonies that transfixed listeners. Greg connected him to high school buddies at other LA universities. Soon, James had built a following and a solid side hustle as a frat party entertainer. He went through a few names: DJ Schrodinger, Starboy XJH, Major Anna Fermion. It should have stayed that way, Greg said wistfully. I thought he was happy, but he always wanted more. One night, Greg was out studying at a friend's house when he got a text from James. "Come home now," the text read, with 20 exclamation points. Greg did what he was told. When he arrived, he found his usually restrained roommate bouncing around like an excited puppy. "You have to see this," he exclaimed, dragging Greg into his room and shutting the door. He turned out the lights, typed a few keys on his computer, and closed his eyes as music flowed forth. It was a recorder piping over a string quartet over a brass band, over a bass line that sounded like a train approaching, Greg said. "I thought I heard screaming cats in there somewhere, too." All the different melodies came together, then broke apart, and then curved. Can music curve? Transfixed, Greg realized he was no longer in James's room. They were outside. He felt the warm air on his face, on an alien planet with a rich maroon sky. Obsidian black tundra stretched forever into the distance on all sides, dotted with throbbing golden orbs emitting the feeling of rough sandpaper. James stood there with him, and before them, a black swamp bubbled. Tar-like globules crawled out, like snakes through a snake charmer, or flowers to the sun. They reached with worm-black tendrils toward the music and began to sway in time with the rhythm. "I don't know how long it lasted," Greg said. "Time meant nothing. Then I was back in James's room, balled up on the floor." As soon as the room stopped spinning and Greg regained his ability to speak, he demanded James tell him what he had done to them. James grinned from ear to ear. "The promise of string theory," he said. "I manipulated matter with my music. I changed our vibrations. I took us into another dimension." James," Greg stammered, What if we couldn't get back? Or if we got hurt or something?" James smiled wider. "We don't need to worry about that. We're essentially ghosts there. Nothing could touch us." Greg had to admit the experience of transporting himself to another dimension through music had been cool. Soon, James incorporated interdimensional tourism into his live sets. He conjured up bubbly pink jungles with cute flying felines, or forests full of multicolored plants and bugs that resembled the drawings of sugar-high kindergartners, or stark, rocky seahorses whose blood-red waves met a blanket of thick blue snow. He gained himself a reputation amongst Southern California's sorority girls and underground EDM fans as the DJ whose music could generate hallucinations without drugs. Again, James should have been happy, but still he wasn't satisfied. On a rainy winter night, Greg returned home late. He heard violin music emanating from James's room. The song was fast and frenetic, jumping around from high octaves to low, jarring and nerve-rattling. Tired and annoyed, Greg went straight to James's room and shoved open the door. Lights flashed from his computer, which James was connected to via his headphones. Acoustic violin at his chin, James' hands danced like dying spiders racing up and down the neck of the instrument. His eyes stared straight ahead, bloodshot and unthinking. On his face, an expression of unspeakable pain and horror. Greg ran to him, pulled off his headphones, accidentally dislodging them from their jack in the process. Music, the music that had driven his roommate to his current state, filled the room, and Greg felt himself tugged violently into James's nightmare. They were trapped in a cave illuminated only by a greenish glow. Metallic spikes, jagged stalagmites, covered the walls and ceiling and floor, jutting out as though to impale prey. A milky white substance, the consistency of glue, moistened the spikes like saliva. A gray thing lurked behind James. A faceless man, made of gray liquid steel, bubbling and dripping and recongealing, its arms wrapped around his waist, leaving his arms free to fiddle like a madman. It bent its hulking form, head over James's head, lips locked to his temple as though it were drinking him. Greg froze, so disturbed by the liquid steel monster he didn't immediately notice the small creature sniffing at his feet. It was a thing the size of a puppy and the shape of a hamster, resembling a sentient steel wool sponge. It opened a mouth much too large and flashed dripping gray teeth like the surrounding stalagmites. It stared up at Greg with gelatinous yellow eyes. Then the world spun, and everything went black. Greg woke sometime later, sprawled on the floor of James' room, behind his desk, surrounded by silence. A trickle of blood ran down his forehead. He pulled himself to his knees and fell against the wall, eyes clenched shut, grasping for a timeline. James got stuck in another dimension. Greg heard the music. He went there too. Nothing was supposed to touch them there, but something did. A creature of molten metal, and it attached itself to James. Greg passed out. As he fell, his body slammed against James' computer, cutting the music. James. Where was James? Greg forced his eyes open. James lay on the ground near him, breath shallow, eyes wide and distant. Greg crawled to him. James' lips moved. 1,000, he muttered. 1,000. 1,000. Then he felt quiet, and his eyes finally closed. Greg couldn't wake his roommate. He dragged him to bed, wrapped him in the blankets, and watched him for hours, terrified he'd stopped breathing. Finally exhausted, Greg fell asleep in James' desk chair. When he awoke the next morning, James was gone. He found his roommate in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee, smiling. "What the heck, James?" Greg stammered. "Last night? What was that?" James eyed Greg strangely. Nothing happened last night. I have no idea what you're talking about." Greg gaped. He reached up and felt the welt over his eye, scraped off dried blood just to remind himself he hadn't dreamed the entire thing up. "Violin playing," he insisted. "The cave with all the spikes, the metallic lava man eating you. The steel wool guinea pig. You don't remember any of this?" James shrugged. "Maybe you should see a therapist, man. I think you're hallucinating." As he turned his back, Greg saw an odd mark on James' neck, a bruise the size of a hickey, but gray and shiny, like a smudge of silver metallic paint. After that day, James became a different person. Wallflower James, who lived in sweats and anime t-shirts, began wearing polos and styling his dirty blonde hair. Shy James, all of a sudden, attracted an entourage of frat boys who'd carry his DJ equipment and chill with him in dive bars. James, who previously spent his free nights reading pulp sci-fi and commenting on classical violin blogs, cultivated a Facebook wall full of photos from drunken club nights, his arms draped around inebriated girls in short dresses. Virgin James, who couldn't look a woman in the eye without blushing, now texted Greg 3 times a week to stay out of the apartment because James would be occupied there with a one-night playmate. "I should have been more supportive, I guess," Greg told me. "I've been trying to push him out of his comfort zone, but that cocky womanizer with bottle service? He wasn't James." It was nearly May by then, and Greg had been accepted into MIT for a master's program. He'd also begun dating his future wife. With finals looming and his roommate inflicted with a douchebag brainworms, he was more than happy to spend his days in the library and his nights with his girlfriend. I'd basically moved out already, he said. Then he sighed. "A professor of mine lent me a book and I'd forgotten about it. I wanted to return it before the school year ended." Determined to return the borrowed book, Greg reluctantly returned to the apartment he'd shared with James. For the last time, he promised himself. But as he approached the door, he felt and heard the familiar rumbling of an EDM bass line. Great, Greg thought. He must have a lady friend over. To save himself from an unsolicited porn soundtrack, He hooked his earphones up to his iPod and blasted 90s hip-hop as they unlocked the door. Quickly as he could, he located the book under a pile of menus, then did a round of the common space, picking up random odds and ends he didn't want to leave behind. Then, Party Up by DMX was interrupted by a woman's scream. Greg acted on instinct. He ran to James' room and forced his way through the locked door. In the process, his earphones were torn from his ears, and James' music dragged him, kicking and screaming, into oblivion. He was back in the cave with jagged spikes and the ghostly greenish glow. The spikes, ever so slowly, moved, curled and extended, refracting the hazy green light with colors and shades Greg couldn't describe with words. The milky white glue substance extended from spike to spike, like a spider web, dripping down in thick globules. And James was there. He stood stock still, the faceless gray liquid steel man behind him, wrapped around him. Moist metallic tentacles wrapped around his arms and legs and torso, gripping his neck and face like long-fingered hands, bleeding into his skin, enveloping him like a defective superhero suit. The gray man was James. James was the gray man. His eyes were wide, bulging, and empty. There was a shuffling at his feet. Greg looked down and doubled over with nausea. What was left of a brown-haired young woman lay on the ground. Her throat had been torn out, her head folded back unpleasantly, unspooled muscles and tendons splayed like streamers. A creature buried itself in her chest. In a gruesome second, Greg recognized the thing as the steel-wool hamster, now the size of a Rottweiler. Its metal fur curled menacingly like a tangle of barbed wire. It jerked upward, turned its large face toward Greg. Its putty yellow eyes glowed with malice. It clutched a hunk of red meat between its jagged teeth, and with a turn of his stomach, Greg realized the chunk of flesh was the dead girl's heart. The creature tossed its head, swallowing the hard whole. Then it redirected its rabid attention towards Greg. It lunged. Greg, in a flash of survival instinct, grabbed his earbuds and forced them into his ears. James' reality-altering EDM creation was blocked out by DMX. The steel-wool monster gnashed its teeth angrily, pressed up against an invisible force field, restrained like a dog on a chain. Greg turned up the volume on his iPad. He knew he didn't have much time. Avoiding the living spikes, he found his way to James' computer. He tore wires, slammed the laptop against the wall, kicked and stomped and smashed the expensive soundboard until it was reduced to a shattered hunk of plastic and rubber and metal. And finally, he pulled out his earphones. He was back in James' room. The air smelled like pennies, with an under scent of sulfur. The girl's destroyed body rested in a pool of blood and entrails. And then there was James. James lay on his back, bloodshot eyes, wide and unblinking. As Greg stood over him, he barely seemed to breathe, his chest contracting weakly under a pit-stained tank top. Greg saw a new marking on his arm, a long blue-gray bruise. Like the hickey on the back of his neck, it caught the light like rusting metal. His lips moved. He forced out words. 995 more. Greg fled the apartment. He banged on a neighbor's door, called the police. The cops arrived to find the young woman dead on the bedroom floor. James was gone. The Bushwick concert wasn't the first, Greg insisted. There have been others in South America, Ibiza. He keeps moving, keeps changing his name. What did it mean, I asked Greg. The last thing he said to you, 995 more. Greg met my eyes. I knew. He knew I knew. That girl, he said. Her name was Devon Slade. She'd been an art student, recently aged out of foster care. and she wasn't his first either. What composure Greg had left in his face broke down. 4 other girls had gone missing around the same time. The police found all 4 buried in shallow graves in the backyard of James' parents' old house. They'd been mauled. Their hearts were torn out of their chests. Greg's story ended there. Mine didn't. That night at the Posey Space, I killed the music. DJ Erich Zann's black automaton roadies melted into gelatinous black puddles. Heart stuck in my throat, stomach in knots. I eased over to the puddle. I extended a toe. Bump, bump, bump. The bass started up again. The puddles bubbled in time with the music. Gummy arms popped out of the mess, pressed against the ground, formed torsos. I said no entry until 10. I whirled, away from the re-emerging humanoids, and toward that grating, robotic alien voice. James Hadley, DJ Erich Zann, stood in front of me, shirtless and bare-faced. His flesh, if you could call it flesh, alternated between metallic blue-black patches that reflected light and rotting dark green tissue that sloughed, hanging off of him, dripping foul-smelling liquid. Bits of his arms had disintegrated, revealing silver-stained muscle. He had no nose, no lips, no teeth, just gaping black holes. He was bald. Black mold extended across his scalp. His bulging eyes, cloudy white, stood out in bas relief, and though I couldn't see his pupils, I felt fury laser-focused on me. Footsteps behind me. His black putty roadies had stabilized, and they'd blocked all the exits. What saved my life that night was a combination of luck and the venue owner's carelessness. I'd bartended many events there, so I knew, behind the stage, a secret trap door and hidden staircase led to the basement. I knew the basement had another staircase that opened through cellar doors to the street. And the owners constantly forgot to lock the said cellar door. I ran, then walked, then collapsed into a heap and cried. Then ran again, walked, circled, rinse and repeat, until I sank onto a bench along Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights, legs too numb to move. I should have, I realized then, called the police. And the police would have thought I was high, I told myself, and even if they'd believed me, it wouldn't have made any difference. 143 people died at the concert. The youngest was 19, the oldest 51. They were students, baristas, poets, stockbrokers, teachers, biologists, taxi drivers, spouses, and parents. Music lovers who only wanted to lose themselves for a night. Their loved ones were told they all died in an electrical fire due to rats biting through the wires. But many people, family and friends, reporters, low-ranking cops and paramedics who'd seen the aftermath, weren't satisfied with the answers they would be given. And as often happens when answers are scarce and higher-ups shut down, certain individuals start asking questions a little louder. For instance, if all 143 victims died in a fire, why had autopsies revealed no smoke in their lungs? Why were the bodies they recovered in pieces? How had an electrical fire torn limbs from sockets with the force of an elephant or bitten at a chest with jaws as wide as a shark's? Why was every single recovered torso missing its heart? And, as a frustrated investigator asked, while showing me a photograph I'm sure he wasn't supposed to reveal, what's the meaning of the words left on the wall? I stared at the words, scrawled in jagged letters, as though by the nails of a broken and bleeding hand. 5 more. I hope you enjoyed DJ Erich Zann by Nicky Exposito as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, You can help support them by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Nicky-Exposito. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/NICKY-EXPOSITO. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. Remember when I was talking about hearts before the story? And music going places? You see, it's not always clever wordplay. Sometimes it's just me foreshadowing a thing or two, or just spoiling it, like a body out in the summer sun. But our little jockey isn't the only fellow who's got a problem with compositions. We now turn to a much more muted scenario. A troubled fellow who just can't seem to get the music out of his head, so to speak. But in this little number from Chisto Healy, sometimes it isn't notes that are the problem. It's how you compose them. Without further ado, I present to you Finding the Melody. Walter had his eyes closed, but he didn't need to see. He could feel the melody in the air. His fingers tapped away at invisible keys as his arms swayed about and his body bounced from side to side like the inflatable people outside car lots. Most importantly, he smiled. The music was the only thing that made Walter smile, that brought him peace and calm, serenity. When the music wasn't playing, there was nothing. People don't realize how profound silence can be. It was the loudest thing he'd ever known. Walter couldn't stand the silence, the nothingness. His own thoughts would scream in his mind just to try to make noise and put an end to it. But it didn't really help, not really. It just made him feel crazier. Sometimes he'd even break things, shatter glass, take a deep breath when the silence shattered with it, at least for a moment. The victory was short-lived, though. After he cleaned up the glass, humming contentedly in rhythm with the clinking pieces and dumped it loudly into the trash can, the silence would fall thick like a blanket thrown over the world. Sound would be sucked away into a vacuum, leaving only madness behind. Sometimes he'd cry, partly from the misery of his condition, but mostly just because crying and sniffling were louder and more rhythmic and musical than regular, ordinary breathing. He could focus on the song of his sadness, and it would get him by for the moment. Anytime Walter tried to confide in someone, to explain how miserable his life was, with the crushing weight of the silence forcing him down into a dark pit of despair, they'd infuriate him by countering with something as simple as, "Why don't you just listen to music or get headphones or something?" It made Walter want to rip their throats out and spit in a hole they tore it from. "Do you think I've never tried that?" he'd ask, with a look like he was trying to decipher if they were crazy or stupid. Listening to music didn't work because it wasn't his. His brain seemed to know that. His tears and sniffles were his, the things he broke and cleaned were his, but the sounds someone else created, recorded, and sold were not. They belonged to their creators, not Walter. It was like existing in two different planes. He could hear the music, but it sounded far away, distant, and foreign. He also heard the silence. It was thick, heavy, and overpowering. They existed simultaneously. It was the same when Walter would go out into the world. Cars would drive, people would talk, and there was so much talking that you couldn't even make out the words. It was like white noise that never ended. And yet it did nothing to stuff down the silence. It was always there, always consuming him and controlling him. Walter knew he'd go insane if he didn't stop the silence. It didn't start until he was an adult, but once it started, it never stopped. It was as much a part of him as the flesh that covered his bones, maybe more so. He went to therapy, but the therapist felt it was something bigger than she could help with, and Walter made an appointment with a psychiatrist. She gave him pills, but they didn't end the silence. The pills didn't make the music. They didn't fix the problem. They only added a new one. They made him feel sad and stole his motivation. He felt tired all the time. He told the doctor and she said, give it a few weeks. When nothing changed, she changed the pills, but the next ones weren't much better. Nothing seemed to work. Walter tried to tell her. He said the new pills gave him bouts of uncontrollable anger. He didn't feel like himself, and it scared him almost as much as the silence. You have to give these medications some time to work, she told him. They accumulate in your system. It's not an instant fix. It takes a few weeks. Walter snarled, but he left. He knew there was no point in arguing. It wouldn't get him anywhere. He went to the coffee shop. He always loved the peacefulness of the atmosphere and the calm he got from a hot cup of joe, but it didn't work this time. No one was there. It was just him and his silence, and the coffee was too hot to drink. He felt so angry. He couldn't contain it. He told himself that it wasn't him, it was the meds. He just needed to let it pass, to remember who he was inside. But he couldn't. Who he was angry. Walter got up from the couch, took his cup from the coffee table, and marched to the counter. It's too hot, he yelled, throwing the liquid into the face of the young man working the register. The boy screamed and grabbed at his face. His tears mixed with the coffee, and Walter watched with fascination. People were telling him to leave, telling him they were going to press charges. Somebody cried about calling the police. Walter didn't run. He didn't argue. He just remained where he was, watching. The police did come. They said something about Walter assaulting the coffee shop barista, but he couldn't really hear them. He couldn't hear them because he was listening to the music. It started when he did something about the anger when he acted. It was subtle and beautiful, like the minor notes on a keyboard, a shadow turned into a melody. It pushed the silence away and gave him a relief, a real relief. For the first time since his 21st birthday, he had never heard anything better. As he rode in the back of the police car, he rode with his eyes closed and a smile on his face. They didn't send him to jail like the coffee shop promised to. They took him to the psych ward in the local hospital, where the silence returned. It was unbearable, but Walter knew better than to talk to people about it. If he did, they would keep him there and throw away the key. They would load him up on meds that made him anxious and angry. He didn't need or want that. So he suffered in silence, sitting on the bed in his room, rocking back and forth, and crying to soothe himself. Any time they came by to do their rounds, Walter made sure to wave and smile. Soon he was back home, alone with the silence. It quickly took over the house and his sanity. He couldn't help but wonder what made the music come when he was at the coffee shop. He focused on that, obsessed over it, in his effort to take his mind off the unbearable quiet. Was it the violence? The pain? He stared into the mirror above his bathroom sink and dragged a box cutter down his cheek. He watched the flesh split, the blood spill, and the silence remained, until, of course, the pain brought the tears from his eyes and the accompanying sobs. He hated it. It hurt so bad. It was a decision Walter quickly regretted. At least it showed him that it wasn't pain that brought the music. It wasn't an act of violence either. It was something else. But for the life of him, Walter didn't know what. He went back to the same hospital he was just released from for stitches. They seemed concerned and wary. None of them seemed to buy his story about tripping while loading the knives into the dishwasher. Their doubt made him so angry. He wasn't sure why, since he was in fact lying to them, but for some reason it really got under his skin. It's none of their business, he thought. They just want to lock me up again, force me to live with the silence and the anger that they give me, the sadness, the misery. Why can't they actually help me? Why can't they do some work and figure out what makes the music happen so I can just be happy and normal and live a life just like theirs? I know why. It's because they don't think I deserve to. They think they're better than me. That's why. And please be careful, the nurse said to him when he was discharged, and make sure to follow the instructions or it'll get infected. You'd like that, wouldn't you? He snapped on his way out. She looked offended by his words, and he didn't care. He walked home with his head high and a symphony playing triumphantly in his mind. It was the most relaxed and happy he'd ever felt. Maybe the hospital had found a way to help him after all. That night, Walter had a peaceful night of sleep without nightmares or stirring. He'd forgotten what a good night's sleep was like. The music had changed everything for him. If he could learn how to make it come, figure out how to master it, he could have the life he'd always wanted, a normal life. That would show those doctors and everyone else who ever looked down on him. Even when the silence returned, it didn't bother him like it normally did. He was too elated to let it. He felt a turning point happening. Walter was in control for the first time in his adult life. Today, the silence sounded like freedom. He was a man on a mission, full of hope for the future. A few days later, his hope dwindled, though, when the music hadn't returned and the crushing silence was ongoing. It started to make him crazy again. He found himself on his living room floor, sobbing without the need to cut himself first. What am I missing? Why won't it come back? Why is God punishing me like this? Was I someone terrible in a past life? I don't understand. I just can't stand the deafening sound of the crashing waves of quiet. Please, help me. Somebody help me. Oh, God. Walter's prayers were answered the next day. A knock at the door sounded like a bass drum in the abyss that was in his mind. No one came to visit him, not even his family. Maybe it was the meds they had him on, but the knock made him feel instantly angry. Walter bounded to his feet, crossed his apartment, and ripped the door open. His landlord stood before him, which Walter found to be incredibly strange. The man never made house calls. He'd just text if he needed to get in touch, or if he was feeling especially informal, he would email. So what the hell's he doing here? Before Walter could actually ask the question, the man answered it. You're later than usual, and you haven't responded to my emails or texts. I figured I should come down here and make sure you were alive. I didn't get any text messages, and yes, I'm alive. You can go now. Well, I really need you to pay, at least, for last month. I can't just let you live here for free, Walter. Do you have anything you can give me now while I'm here? Walter froze for a moment, just staring at him, the anger building inside of him. At last, he nodded. Yeah, okay, come in. I'll write you a check. The landlord stepped in and pulled the door gently closed behind him. A check isn't going to bounce, is it, Walter? I don't want you to write it if you don't have the money to cover it. Why do you think I don't have the money? Walter asked, his anger rising. It's not that I think you don't have it. I was just checking and letting you know that if you don't, that I'd rather you tell me now than write a bad check. The man eyed the gauze strapped to his cheek. What happened to your face? Is everything okay, Walter? Walter jammed a finger in the man's face. You're here because you want money. Stop acting like you care about me. The reason you wanted to make sure I wasn't dead was to assure that I could still pay you what I owe you. If I was dead, I don't think you'd even come to the funeral. You'd go home, bitch to your high and mighty wife that I died, and now you'd be out a bunch of money. At least be real. The landlord looked like he'd been slapped. His lips moved like they were trying to remember how to say the words, or maybe they were looking for the right ones before making a sound. Seeing this made Walter smile. In that moment, music started playing in his head. It was beautiful, a new melody, made of so many different styles of percussion overlapping. He closed his eyes for a moment, his fingers playing in the air. Yes, he could hear the piano now. Walter, the man said, are you all right? His eyes snapped open. All right. All right. I'm fantastic. The man looked nervous. then worried. He swallowed hard. Okay, well, if you can get that check for me, I need to be getting home. Walter's smile widened. I won't be getting that check for you. Oh? Oh, he marked. Yeah, you heard me. I won't be writing a check, and it's not because I don't have the money. I do have the money. I just don't want to give it to you. I'll pay you when I feel like it because I think you're a jerk. Why don't you go home and tell your wife that? The music got louder and Walter trembled. The notes were in his blood now, traveling through his veins. It was the most alive he had ever felt. Walter, I can see you're upset, so I'll go and speak to you later when you're feeling calmer because I don't really want to end up in court over this. Walter shushed him. He closed his eyes again and listened to the wind instruments. He was the composer of his own destiny. It was glorious. When his eyes flicked open, he saw the landlord heading towards the door, looking to make his escape. Walter felt energized by this, powerful, and the music responded in turn. He grabbed something off the table nearby and hurried to catch the man before he made it to the door. When he grabbed the landlord's shoulder, the man stopped and turned around to look at him. I decided I don't want to calm down, Walter said, and I'm not going to pay you later. I'm not going to pay you ever. Before the landlord could respond, Walter brought the hammer down, steel crashing with a loud thunk on the man's temple, taking him to the floor. Walter, smiling, music blaring, straddled him and brought the hammer down several more times. He made sure to time the strikes with the beats of the bass drum so he didn't disturb the rhythm of the music. He hated waiting days for it to return. He wasn't going to ruin it. It was everything he had hoped for, and more. When he was done beating the landlord's head in, he ran, humming the melody into his head. He went into his bedroom and seized his acoustic guitar. Then he sat down on the floor beside the landlord's still squirming, heavily bleeding body, his legs folded under him. He closed his eyes and let his fingers move by instinct, playing the melody of the song of the guitar. He had never played so fluidly. Certainly would have been able to write something so complex, so intricate, not a day in his life. He needed destiny to write it for him. Walter panicked then because he realized he might not be able to play it once again after the silence returned, and he knew it would. He needed to do more than play along with it in the moment. He had to record it. He scrambled to his feet and ran to get his laptop. Hurriedly, he opened it on the coffee table and got his recording program going. Then he sat before it again, closed his eyes, and started to play. The landlord moaned in agony, and Walter opened his eyes in a hurry. He stopped the recording and screamed. "You just ruined it," he screamed. "It's temporary. You have to be quiet." He dove into the man again and wrapped his hands tightly around his throat. Walter's teeth clenched and his muscles strained in his own neck as he squeezed with everything he had. When he was sure the man would be quiet, he sat down and recorded again, his heart racing to its own rhythm and ignoring the music. He was so scared that it would end before he got it, but it didn't. He played it and recorded it, and it was beautiful. He wanted to listen to what he made, but he couldn't get the timing right, and the melody was still going inside his head. If he couldn't time it exactly, then it was like listening to two versions of the same song overlapping off time. It was nerve-wracking and infuriating, and he'd felt so much anger already. He didn't want to feel more. He wanted to live in this special moment, to enjoy it, and he sighed contentedly, sat back against his couch, and let himself. When the morning came, Walter could still hear the music. It was quieter, but it was there. It had never lasted that long before. This was proof of the change in how he understood it. He knew what it meant, what he had to do. With a sigh, he looked over at the dead man, who'd spilled quite a bit of blood onto his floor. Before he could do anything, Walter had to get rid of his landlord. He put his laundry into garbage bags, even though he had a laundry room and a washer and a dryer that worked just fine. Then he put the landlord in his bathtub and worked on making him into smaller, more portable pieces. He hadn't done anything like this, but he didn't want the body to stay in his tub, so he sprayed the entire tub with buttered oil spray for cooking pans. All it really managed to do was make things more slippery and hard to handle. Thankfully, the music was playing faintly in the background, which kept him patient. He took the landlord's pieces and put them in black garbage bags, just like his clothes. He took all the bags with him downstairs toward the front doors and purposely, accidentally, spilled one of the clothing bags, cursing to sell it. "Hey, that's a lot. You need some help?" a woman from the first floor said, rushing over to him. "Oh, washer broke. I'm just trying to make it to the laundromat," he said. "Walking? Well, that's crazy. Let me give you a ride." "Oh, thanks. That'd be really nice." Walter loaded the bags into her trunk. Then he went around and got into the passenger seat. "So, what do you do?" the woman asked as she drove. "I'm a musician, actually," Walter said with a smile. "It doesn't pay much yet, but I believe it will. My new piece is my best yet." "Oh, can I listen?" "I'd love that, but right now it's only on my laptop at home." "Oh, another time then," she said with a smile. He unloaded at the laundromat, thanked her, waved, and walked around the building to throw half the bags in the dumpster. Then he brought the remainder inside and paid to wash them in front of witnesses, hoping it would seal his alibi. Music was getting louder and more elaborate, so he assumed he was doing something right. When his clothes were done, he lugged the bags home and was happy not to see the woman who drove him for fear that she would notice that he had fewer bags than when she took him there. When he was safely back inside his apartment and feeling accomplished, the music was going strong. Walter was a new man. It was several days before the music finally faded into oblivion, and another day after that before the weight of the silence really started to get to him again. He felt okay, though, because for once in his life, Walter was prepared. He knew what he needed to do to find peace. As the silence crept around, poking his mind with sharp sticks, Walter just tried to push it away and think of who he needed to face, who he needed to release emotion with, or, more appropriately, at. He settled on his dad. His father wasn't evil. He didn't abuse him or beat on his mom or any of that stuff, but he was the one to constantly tell Walter that he would never make it as a musician, that he needed to get a real job and live like a normal person and get his head out of the clouds. Walter realized that it was then, when he canceled his dreams, that the silence began. It was his father's fault that he lived in such constant, agonizing quiet, that he never slept soundly and could barely breathe because the silence was so suffocating. Now that Walter knew how to make the music win out of the silence, it had to be his father who helped him to create his next piece. He called him and invited him over to the apartment for a talk. The old man sounded annoyed and immediately said, "I'm not giving you money if that's what you're looking for." Walter wanted to curse him, but he didn't because he knew the man would hang up and never come if he did. It was more important to have him there and get the music back. He was forced to swallow his pride. "I'm not looking for money, Dad." An hour later, the man was at his door, and Walter was letting him in with a smile. One hard swipe of a bookend, and the father was face down where his landlord had died. Walter got him up, tied him to a chair. He was panting and sweating with exertion. His father, his dead weight, was a lot harder to lift and hold than he anticipated. Live and learn. "What the hell are you doing?" the old man said when he awoke. "What I need to do," Walter snapped. "You couldn't let me just be who I was. You had to silence me. Silence my dreams, silence my art. Silence my voice when I tried to speak on my own behalf. You killed the music in me. Unplugged my speakers and plugged my entire world into agonizing quiet. You're mad, Walter." "Shut it," he yelled. "You don't get to shoot me down anymore. I know how to make the music come back, how to get it to stay." "By what? Hurting me? Killing me? What?" Walter shook his head and said, "No, Dad. There was a time when I thought those things were the answer, actually, but I was wrong. It was never about violence, pain, or blood. It was about me. The silence, that God-forsaken silence, was a cork. It held me inside and wouldn't let me out. Every time I spoke the truth and acted out on my own behalf, the music returned. I had to let myself out to pop the cork, to set my soul free. Don't you understand?" "So you're not going to hurt me?" the father asked. "Oh, I'm definitely going to hurt you. But I wanted to be clear. I'm not going to hurt you to make music. I'm going to hurt you because I want to, and that's what's going to make the music. But don't worry, it's going to be beautiful." It already was. Just saying everything he said made the new piece start to form in his mind, and it was wonderful. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see. He could feel the melody in the air. His fingers tapped away at invisible keys as his arms swayed about and his body bounced from side to side. Then his hand grabbed the hammer off of the table. I hope you enjoyed Finding the Melody by Chisto Healy as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Chisto-Healy. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/Chisto-Healy. Well, at least he's happy, even if the people around him aren't. But it certainly gives a whole new meaning to hitting those high notes, doesn't it? Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author, as well as all of our other authors who provided us with tonight's stories. Now, before we go, I'd also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining me on this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring Twice the Terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs. Or become a patron for as little as $5 a month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, all of it ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back to 2014, and you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?